Hello, Mr. Craig. It is lovely to see you again. I feel like I haven't seen you for ages.
Oh, hang on a minute. I need to hold myself steady. The world is spinning too fast. We need somebody to stop the spin. Who could it be? Oh, hello, Shauna. How you doing?
Of course, Phil is referring to Shauna and Phil Unspin the World. And that's quite a snazzy name. How did we come up with that one?
I don't know. Too much late night tweeting to each other, I think. I think there's something appealing in two people on the opposite side of the planet trying to work out what the hell's going on, which I think is what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, that is what we're trying to do. Originally, it was going to be Shauna and Phil Save the World, but we thought that was a little grandiose, you know.
Yes, we're not Elon Musk yet. We don't.
No. We just we're wannabes. We're wannabes. But I laughed when I looked back at some of our messages, and I actually sent you a suggestion for a name, and I sent you Chin Wagging Chums, and you replied, "Have another beer."
Well, the way we work is one of us is usually having a drink because we tend to communicate in the morning or the evening because of where we are. I'm on the coffee this morning. I'm not going to ask what you're on.
I'm not. I wouldn't dare. All
right.
We're discussing a very serious subject tonight, and Phil and I want to talk about grooming gangs. Now, before we sort of kick off, I did want to say that I find grooming gangs a pretty weaselly word. I would rather call it RAPE gangs. But this is YouTube, and if we do that, our video will be buried because we're not quite big enough yet to be able to get away with things like that. So we will be referring to it as grooming gangs throughout this podcast. So I wanted to kick off with Elon Musk, Phil, because really, like him or loathe him, he has shone a spotlight on this issue. And I would imagine that victims would be thrilled because he's put such an international, harsh scrutiny on this that no one can escape it now. What's your take on it?
Well, you know, I know a little bit about scandals. And if you think about some of the biggest scandals in recent British history, the post office scandal, the infected blood scandal, they were sort of known about, but it took some really big emotional moment for them to become really dominant in the conversation. Usually that meant a TV drama. Musk has done the same for this story. You know, we've known about this for a long time. There have been inquiries, there have been court cases. But the scale of it and the detail and the grim horror of it and the sense that a lot of people kind of edged away from it without ever really being punished. And I mean people, not just the perpetrators, but those who covered it up and looked the other way. All of that's remained buried. And I think, whatever you think of Musk, he has boosted it to the very top of the agenda. I mean, I'm sitting here now. Later today, there's a debate in the House of Commons. It's going to be very bitter. But that wouldn't have happened without what Musk did, you know. And I'm not a huge fan of Musk over many things, but he's done us a service, I think, in this respect.
Yes, and it's interesting that debate today, Keir Starmer has actually given instructions to all the Labor MPs that they are not to vote for a national inquiry. Do you think that's a wise move or just a provocative move that's just going to make everybody even angrier?
I'm not sure he has much choice, given where he is at the moment. I think a national inquiry of the type that's been suggested is inevitable and will happen because they always do. I suspect Starmer's been knocked sideways by the scale and the vehemence of the reaction and his own poll ratings, which have been going like this. And it's not unconnected to this story and others like it. I think one thing I would like to say, being an old Labour man myself, this was always about the Labour Party. These events took place in towns that were run by the left. Supervised by police commissioners who were appointed by left-wing councils and police committees and had left-wing MPs and Labour MPs. And the very first people who blew the whistle were Labour councillors and Labour MPs. But that was like a sort of old Labour, maybe a slightly sterner Labour, maybe a bit more self-confident Labour, I don't know. But they ran into this kind of new miasma of, oh, you can't say that. No, we can't go there. You know, and this seems to be at the heart of the problem. Look at someone like Julie Bindel, a great socialist feminist writer who was the very first person to write about this 20 odd years ago. And she just got such a lot of stick from other people on the left for saying things that made them feel really, really uncomfortable. And I think that's at the heart of it. And deep down, that's why Starmer today is doing what he's doing. It's still too hard for them to face up to it. What some of their own people did, members of the party and people connected to the party and voters for their party in the social work department and the police and the schools. And this is the stuff that's never really been exposed that's coming out now, I think. These stories of policemen driving past cars where teenage girls, 14-year-old girls, 13-year-old girls are having sex in the car, seeing it and driving on. Girls coming to police stations are being sent back with their abusers because those girls were not respected or nobody wanted to kind of go there and name the problem.
Yeah, yeah. When you said that about old Labor, it made me realise that it's mainly, working class people that are being affected by these crimes and these gangs in these areas. And I'm thinking they don't have anyone to champion them. Because if you've got their traditional party not wanting to know and not wanting to, create any ruffles or anything like that, and traditionally the Conservative Party wasn't their champion, so who have they got? They've got Elon Musk tweeting about it and drawing attention to it. I thought it was laughable when a lot of people said that billionaires shouldn't get involved in politics. I thought, where have you been? I mean, billionaires have always been involving themselves. Look at Gina Reinhardt in Australia. I mean, she's had enormous influence over our, governments, but that's another podcast. I wanted to focus on not so much the politics of this story, but I wanted to focus on the bravery of the whistleblowers, as you've already pointed out. Particularly, I'm fascinated and really moved by Maggie Oliver's story. Jane Senior, who was betrayed and rejected by her own party. The courage of victims, yet again. We have spoken about so many stories, haven't we, in our short time together? The courage of victims. And if it wasn't for their courage, we wouldn't have the accurate details of this horrific story, would we?
We would not. And I think actually one of the more positive things, if you can say such a word about this sort of subject, one of the more positive things about the last year or so is people are speaking out. And I do see a link actually here to the Pellico story, in France, that here is a situation where men given the chance will do appalling things. Now, those men were very different to the men operating in Rotherham and Rochdale. And it's fair to say that men of all backgrounds will behave appallingly given the chance. She'll never know, she's unconscious. Or, my cousin slept with her, so I can sleep with her. And the fact that women are speaking out more forcefully about this, and I think we may be seeing it in other countries as well, the Iranian women, Afghan women, there is a wave of, I think, female activism that hopefully is really catching. And Maggie Oliver, Julie Bindel, Anne Cryer, somebody I worked with a long time ago, Labour MP from Keighley, were the first people to raise this, found themselves running into a kind of, I use the word miasma, there's never any one individual that says, you can't do that. But there's just phone calls are not returned. You're not selected to speak. It's just made very clear to you that this is uncomfortable, so we can't go there. But they've kept going. And that's and more than Musk, it's because of their courage that we're here today, really talking about it in detail and trying to finally put a finger on some of those men, and they were all men, who did send the girls home. And I think the police have a lot to answer for in this, which is the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and beyond in northern Britain, place I know well. I was brought up in a town that had one of these scandals. And it's also the same towns that saw the Yorkshire Ripper scandal and Jimmy Savile. And in all of these stories, there is a similar connection, which is working class girls from vulnerable backgrounds on the margins of society not being treated properly human. You don't investigate that story because, it's that girl from the children's home. Oh, she's run away several times and she likes a drink. Oh, she's got a rich boyfriend. He's got a car and him and his mates come round and she goes with them willingly,
Yeah,
Really? That went on for so long.
And the extraordinary lapses just in lack of reporting with people that are supposed to care for these girls. And even on the rare occasions where people did report things and try to get help, like you say, they were just dismissed. And these were girls that were so young, 12, 13. I mean, children.
Yeah.
Shocking.
Not just dismissed, sometimes actually given back physically to the men who were abusing them.
Yes, yes.
You get her home all right. Here's a couple of quid for a bus fare. And
Yeah.
of course, they're straight back in the flat.
Yes, yes.
And it's just,
shocking.
we don't treat these girls in the way that, I hate to say it, a middle class girl. I mean, there's been enough abuse stories across society, of course, but it's because they're working class from these sort of, maybe they're children's homes, that there's problems in the family, there's abuse in the family. They're just marked down as being less valuable to the state. And that's Julie Bindel actually said that from the very word go, that they're marked as victims by everybody, not just in the community that's abusing them, even by the people that's meant to protect them. They're just marked down as victims.
One of the things that has made me a little testy over the last few days when I've been looking into this is a few people have actually said to me when I've tweeted certain things that the race is irrelevant and that, we shouldn't be focusing on the race of the men that conducted these huge abuse gangs. And for me, that just seems really sticking your head in the sand because it's an uncomfortable truth. It's not one that I, enjoy. But even the person, now, what's her name? I've got to check this. Sorry, I've got Dr. Alexis Jay, who was the former chair of the National Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. In her report that she handed down in 2022, she said that information on race could help prevent and help with detection of these gangs and help to put paid to them. It was one of her recommendations of her report. None of them have been implemented at all. So to me, that's enough. If someone that conducts an inquiry over 7 years, it takes £18.6 million to conduct this, and 7,000 victims came forward and gave her solid evidence and solid stories. And she's saying this data about race and, it has to be collected because it's the only way to confront this. And when people go back to that sort of old trope, well, look, race isn't important. It's the children that matter. They're just sort of perpetuating exactly the same thing of why this hasn't been dealt with for 20 years.
Well, people will say it, and rightly so, most abuse is carried out in the home. Most abusers are fathers and stepfathers, uncles. And in a country like Britain, most of those people are white. And so when you raise the grooming gangs, they say, well, you're just looking at them because they're not white. You're a racist. There's something wrong with you. The trouble is that we're talking about two very different things. Abuse in the home is a shocking and terrible thing, but it tends to be secret, furtive, hard to prove, hard to dig into. These were almost semi-public acts of gang rape. They happened not secretly. People knew in the communities, the men who were carrying them out, openly talked about it and joked about it and texted each other. But also the social services knew and the police knew and local councillors knew. And very rarely did they do anything. That's why this is different.
Yes.
And because it was a group action, the fact that they were all in the same ethnic group, often they were related, cousins and uncles. I mean, it's grim.
Yeah.
She slept with my uncle, I'm going to sleep with her tomorrow.
Yeah.
But that is a part of it. The Pellico abusers were all white. We know that men can do appalling things given half a chance, it would seem.
Yeah.
But in this instance, race,
it is different.
ethnicity, prejudice about these girls, or they're just, they're not properly protected by the men in their life, so we can prey upon them. That's a factor. But it is actually, when you boil it all down, that is the reason why so little accountability happened, because people just didn't want to go there.
They didn't want to go there. It was just they didn't want to be accused of institutional racism, so they just put it in the too hard basket. But I think Maggie Oliver really impacted me. She's been all over the media over the last week. She must be absolutely exhausted. I was just going to briefly tell people her story. She was working in the Greater Manchester area as a police detective, and she was working on Operation Augusta. Now, in Operation Augusta, they actually got solid evidence against 100 Pakistani British Muslim men. Now, she's the one that makes that very clear distinction that there was a gang of Pakistani British Muslim men. And she thinks that's significant because it was how they were able to sort of operate in this sort of such effective manner and seemingly get away with it for so long. But they collected evidence, 100 of them, against 36 underage victims. She goes on compassionate leave because her husband of 30 years has cancer. He dies. She comes back to work and it's been buried. Now, she knows that the evidence they collected would have stood up in court. She worked on it for 2 years, 2004, 2005, experienced police detective, knew they had them, knew they had even DNA evidence. And it was buried and the excuse was given that there's not enough money to go ahead with it. And she said they already had it. They already had everything they needed to go ahead with the prosecution. And so she goes and, speaks to lots of people in authority. At this stage, she still has this naive hope that it really is about budget. Then she goes over to another one. They ask her to actually go, now was it Rochdale or Rotherham?
Rochdale.
Yeah,
Rochdale, Rotherham.
Okay. She does it all again, gets let down again. Again, there's hundreds of men, crimes against 76 children. They prosecuted one man after that investigation and he got 4 years, not for rape, for conspiracy. 4 years.
Now, her story is one of the worst. I mean, Lucy Allen, the Tory MP from Telford, another town where there's been a scandal of this kind, wrote, I think just yesterday, about how she was visited by the police commissioner and by the committee that appointed the police commissioner and basically said, can you please stop talking about this? We're worried. It's going to mess up community relations. This is an MP. And I think it just conveys a sense of kind of powerlessness to people. And this, I think, is also fueling a lot of the anger we are seeing now. There's a guy in Rochdale. He's been in the papers today. He's served a sentence. He raped a 14-year-old and arranged for others to rape her. He served his sentence. He was supposed to be deported 8 years ago. He's still not been deported. But do you know why he's not been deported? Because of his rights to a family life, are guaranteed under the Human Rights Act and the European Human Rights Court. Rights to a family life, when you've done that to a child, you see, that is just wrong. And whether you're left, right, or anywhere in the middle, you know that's wrong. We all know that's wrong. And yet there we are, apparently powerless to do anything about it. And this man, he's a delivery driver now for Deliveroo. Imagine he turns up on your doorstep.
Yes.
And there's no contrition with him and his mates. It's like, well, there's no big mea culpas. We got it wrong. We're gonna improve ourselves and learn our lessons. It's all, we were stitched up. It was racism. The girls were asking for it. They were prostitutes.
Yeah.
And we feel powerless to do anything about men like this who should be out the door.
Yeah.
No questions asked. And that should be something that any decent Labour Party or any government should just instinctively know. And yet we've sort of lost that knowledge. And it's like we've lost the self-confidence to do even the most basic social management of some really, really bad people. And I'm sorry, I'm sounding really depressing now. I come from the north of England. I love the north of England. There's some amazing people in the north of England. And there's some amazing Labour Party MPs and councillors, and some of them a friend of mine. It's not everybody, but it's just, it just took root. And I think it kind of sapped people's self-confidence.
Yeah, I guess if we're going to be unbiased about this, we have to point out that report that had all these recommendations, 20 recommendations, was not actioned by the Conservative Party when they were in power. Keir Starmer's government say they're now going to get on to it. I would imagine that they really don't have any choice at this point because, but at least they have that to action, which will probably make a difference, I would imagine, which is great.
The report you're talking about was very impressive, and the things that it recommended will come to pass. What it didn't do, though, is do the really difficult thing, which is what people are now asking for, which is to kind of name and shame the enablers, to look into some of these towns, Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, and say, well, why wasn't it stopped? And should, because a lot of people have gone on, councillors are now MPs, police officers that were on the desk are now chief constables. You dig into what they did 15 years ago, they're going to lose their jobs and their pensions. That's what's another thing that's driving this.
Well, that was one of the recommendations, that people should be held accountable for failure to report, failure to take action, failure to protect, that they should even be criminally prosecuted. Which,
and going forward, they're going to make it so, and that's good. But retrospectively, it's not happened. And
of course.
That's what they're asking for now.
Well, you're just talking blatantly about negligence. I mean, it's blatant negligence. And so you think you should be. I wonder whether there might be a way around that with maybe civil cases, maybe group actions. Maybe they can sort of get some traction that way against certain identified people. I don't know. But also we've got to get on to the allegations against Keir Starmer, 5 years Director of Public Prosecutions from 2008 to 2013. People have come out in the last 24 hours in his defence and said that changes he made while he was director, actually resulted in more convictions than had previously. But the general mood and the anger against him is that he's trying to stop this inquiry because it will expose his tenure as Director of Public Prosecutions. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it will expose a lot of people in his party who are doing the sort of jobs in Rotherham and Rochdale when they looked the other way when they handed the girls back.
Do you think that if convictions, from now, if things change and people are held accountable and not burying their head in the sand and there's convictions, do you think there should be people being deported if they're charged with a criminal offence?
Well, if they're convicted,
if they're not born in Britain, obviously.
Yeah, if they're foreign nationals and they commit these kind of vile crimes, of course they should be deported.
But no one was, were they?
Well, I think a few were, but some high-profile ones, like the man I mentioned from Rochdale, certainly wasn't. And he's kind of used British law. And this is another thing that, you pass laws with the best of intentions. Another one is the People Smuggling Act that Theresa May, the Tory PM, passed to protect against people smuggling gangs, bringing in women for brothels. Now, that's a very good piece of legislation that we would probably all support. But guess what? It has been twisted so that people who actually willingly came in small boats claim, I was trafficked, can't send me home. And again, it's well-intentioned laws created by liberal-minded people being kind of manipulated by those who are just out to kind of game the system. They push over society, They can take advantage of a society.
Yes, Well, it'll be interesting to see how this develops. I am interested in what Maggie Oliver said about Keir Starmer. She said she has no faith in the Prime Minister to get to the truth. Now, that seems to me an informed opinion to me. And the other thing, the other quote, the only other one I'll share, which really is just so impactful, is they have failed. She's talking about the CPS, the police, others in authority. They have failed repeatedly, knowingly, criminally. And she just cuts to the chase, doesn't she?
Oh, she does, and I admire her enormously. Whether I don't necessarily share everything she says about Starmer, there are other people who, have done similar great work on this subject who wouldn't be quite so hard on Starmer himself. But I can't stand here and defend what's happened. Clearly, I'm not. It's shocking. It's shocking that we were so powerlessness and self. I should use the word. Hitchens used to use it as well. Civilizational self-loathing. We feel that we're always in the wrong. So the idea of imposing values on somebody else, but some values are worth imposing, like 14-year-olds shouldn't be raped. There's nothing wrong with saying that is a better value than whatever values that bloke in Rochdale believed in.
Yes.
I have no problem in saying that.
It's interesting when you talk about laws being manipulated, because I actually looked up the reaction when we had our own gangs in Sydney in 2000. The New South Wales government was pretty quick to respond. Bob Carr was Premier at the time, and he didn't shy away from actually pointing out that, it was thought that this was really a hate crime. He was quite forward in saying that. And they actually passed laws where they made it higher penalties. So in other words, that if you commit a crime of abuse against a victim in a gang, pretty much the outcome, the punishment was doubled because of that circumstance, which has actually proved to be quite effective. But the unfortunate thing is I actually tweeted about that, and then someone put a reply underneath and blamed the Cronulla riots on those activities, which is completely false because they occurred in 2000 and the Cronulla riots occurred in 2005. They're completely unrelated. And that's the thing, that both sides can gather this and use it and weaponize it, adding misinformation and get everyone very upset about the whole thing. And in the end, you can't tell what's real and what's not real. I mean, you would have to be very used to researching things to be able to determine what we're hearing, what is valid and what is not. It's very hard to determine that.
I was a big fan of Bob. Bob Carr was a Labour man, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the old school Labour that I mentioned earlier. That's the tradition, I think, that someone like Anne Cryer or Julie Bindel comes from. Because, you come from those communities, they can be a bit chaotic and they actually people need to be punished. It was always the Tories that stood for the gambling house and the rioters and the brewing. And Labour was all, temperance and Sunday school and clean shoes on a Saturday.
Yeah.
That Labour, that's Bob Carr's Labour, is the one that will police this stuff properly. And I think we need to get back to that Labour and move away from the sort of, I can't say this, oh my God, I'm going to be called names. And who am I to judge, Labour, which I'm afraid is what we've seen revealed in this scandal.
Have you got anybody that you can see as a future Labor leader that would be like that?
I'm quite a big fan of Wes Streeting, actually. I think he's an interesting person, and if he can do sort of the NHS out. And let's face it, our Tory party hasn't exactly excelled itself in recent years. There's a reason why Starmer's number 10. He's not particularly liked. But in the last election, he got a landslide. They called it the Loveless landslide because the country was like, no, the Tories, you need to go away now. So we're stuck with him. Let's hope he can gather some confidence and take some action, certainly on this story. I fear today will be disappointing, but I think eventually they are going to have to do something because this isn't going away.
Well, I thought for our podcast next week, we might actually pick a comment from...
Can we not do something a bit less serious?
And you pick one, I'll pick one.
Yes.
And then we'll try and pick one that we can discuss and maybe argue over. And, so we'll just see.
I think this is actually quite a good test for us because, if we're trying to bring, fair perspectives, we don't want to get into our trenches. We don't want to be kind of the gang warfare mentality and to really try to understand who's saying what and why. And that's what I would mean by unspinning the world.
Yes, I think that's so important.
What I'm all about.
I don't want people to be able to tell sort of which way we lean politically necessarily. I want to always sort of just address an issue. And depending on the issue, sometimes we may be right, sometimes we may be left. And,
exactly.
Most podcasts you can identify. That's a right-leaning podcast. That's a left-leaning podcast. I'm really hoping to do something different with you with this.
Me too.
And, so I don't know. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be an experiment.
When it goes out, underneath us right now, there were people saying, well, you're not doing it very well. But maybe some of them will say something differently. Let's hope so.
You came across very solidly as a Labor guy.
Well, I used to be. I mean, I'm not actually a member of the party anymore. I almost got a big job on Tony Blair. It's a different story for another day.
Oh, no, tell it. Go on.
Okay, well, I was on the shortlist to replace Peter Mandelson as Director of Communications. He was like the man that really invented New Labour in the 90s. And I was on the shortlist of 3 to replace him. I did not get the job.
Wow. How would that have changed your life, do you think?
Well, I would have been in Downing Street with Blair. I would have been a player. I'd have had to work with the rather difficult Alistair Campbell.
Right.
He would probably have been my boss, which could have been challenging. But, it was an exciting time. New Labour in the late 90s, Cool Britannia. It would have been pretty cool to be a part of that. But I went a different direction.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. So I just want to ask you, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you your take on Jess Phillips. Do you think that, the heat she's getting is just part and parcel of the job and, basically just suck it up and focus on the victims? Because there seems to be an awful lot of attempts to generate an awful lot of sympathy for her at the moment. Do you feel sympathy for her?
Well, for many years, she has done this annual event where she stands up in Parliament and reads the name of every murdered woman in Britain. There's no doubt that for 20 years, she's been an absolutely tireless campaigner for women. She's got this job. She's got the political pressure and the heat. She came out last night and talked about how it was affecting her. I thought she got the tone of that really very badly wrong, I'm afraid to say, Jess. I thought she came across as me, when actually there are some truly terrible stories of girls and women that she should have focused on. So no, I don't think she's called this one right. And you have to wonder about a few of her past statements when there was that awful thing at New Year's Eve a couple of years ago in Germany where lots of men were groping girls, and a lot of them were recent immigrants, sad to say. And they were groping girls and really quite unpleasantly assaulting girls in the street. She went on British television and made light of it and said, oh, well, it's just like a night out in Birmingham, isn't it? Well, it isn't.
I read that, yeah.
So I've kind of, my long-standing admiration for Jess has been challenged, I have to say, by what she's said and done in the last little while. Sorry to say.
There's a lot of that minimising language, isn't there? And that's basically what she was doing. She was just minimising it, making light of it. We talked about that when we discussed Fired, and there seems to be a common theme, doesn't there? And there seems to be such a common theme of police failure.
Totally.
It's just extraordinary. People must be feeling quite vulnerable in the UK now because it's quite evident that there's just such alarming police failure.
Well, I think that's right. And that's one of the reasons why this request for a new inquiry is not going to go away, because it's until we know just who did what in these police stations when girls turned up in distress, asking for help and were sent away. And this didn't just happen once. Unless we know why, they would drive past graveyards and see groups of men having sex with a girl and just sort of drive on. And there's some exchanges in some of the documents, where she said, we're just doing X in the car, mate. And the cop would say, all right, we'll make sure she gets home safe.
Oh.
Hello? This is in front of you, a sexual crime against a child.
Do you think it was fair? Do you think it was fear?
No, I think actually, and this comes out with Savile, because a lot of girls, maybe from a similar background, were drawn into the Savile world.
Oh, okay.
It's just that they are, they're on the margins of society. They're I say vulnerable. They're seen as being active participants, even though legally they're not allowed to give consent. That's why we have those laws.
Yeah.
But they were seen as being as much a part of it as the men themselves, and it's best not to cause
also
us.
That's a point.
Make sure she gets home. Or something.
Well, that's a point to make. Some of the most heartbreaking stories were, those girls were too scared to sort of alert the police that they're in trouble, help me, because their families would be threatened. Their younger sister would be threatened. One had, the younger brother had their legs broken. So they knew that if they didn't play ball, that their families would actually be attacked.
Yeah, it's a tale as old as time, but it was just, often it would start with somebody they thought was a boyfriend, had a bit of money, had a car, could take him out, buy him a nice present or two, get them drinking drugs. They think they're in love, and then it goes on from there, and then they eventually end up being shared around, and it gets more and more abusive, and they can't escape.
Yeah.
And it's ghastly, and they go for help, and no help is forthcoming.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly been a big first episode.
I know.
and we will have to follow it up with comments next week, but hopefully maybe we can discuss something a little lighter for our second episode.
There's plenty
we'll
of
put our heads together.
There's plenty of spin and big stories, and I think in the next few years in America, with Mr. Trump coming into power, is going to give us plenty of material. Isn't he about to invade Canada?
Yeah. And Phil and I are sort of going to attempt to cover that without bias. And so this is going to be really interesting because we're going to try and present both sides of any story.
We will.
And then we'll give our opinion. But, it's going to be a challenge, I think.
It's going to be fun. Is that world still, is it world still spinning?
No, we've unspun it. We've unspun it. Okay, Phil, I'll see you next week.
Very good to talk to you. See you soon.
Bye. Bye.